Welcome to Tech Right Now, the weekly podcast of the American Conservative. I'm Andrew Day, here with my colleagues Jude Russo and Joseph Addington. We've got a big show today. We'll be getting into both domestic politics and foreign affairs. First, we'll discuss President Donald Trump's uses of presidential power in recent weeks. The FBI raided the Maryland home of John Bolton, Trump's former national security advisor, though we should say Trump denies ordering or knowing in advance about the raid. Trump fired or claimed to have fired Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook, and he issued an executive order entitled Prosecuting Burning of the American Flag, though the Supreme Court has ruled that flag burning constitutes symbolic political speech protected by the First Amendment. After discussing those things, we'll talk a little bit about Latin America. I'll get some updates from Joseph Addington, our Latin America specialist. The U.S. may be gearing up for some kind of military action against Venezuela. So we'll talk about that. And we'll give a quick take on where the Russia Ukraine war and the Gaza war are going over the next few weeks and whether we'll get a new Iran war during that time. So, Jude, I mentioned some uses or apparent uses of presidential power that have stirred controversy in recent weeks. If you listen to like liberal podcasts, they seem to think that these things are a very big deal. Maybe not the flag burning thing. I don't know if that's getting as much play, but certainly the firing of Lisa Cook and the raiding of the home of John Bolton, even though basically nobody likes John Bolton. Sometimes he's called a neocon. I don't even think that's true. He's just like a radical hawk who obviously has alienated himself from basically everyone except for like never Trump Republicans. So critics of Trump see all these moves that I named as examples of creeping authoritarianism. They say Trump is undermining or disregarding the independence of the FBI, the Federal Reserve, the judiciary. So just take whichever of these issues most interest you and tell me, do you see a misuse of presidential power here?
Uh, I'm going to work through them in the reverse of the order that you gave them because I think that uh, the flag burning executive order is interesting and kind of illustrates the thematic dynamic that you see across all of these actions, which is the rhetoric of the White House conveys significantly more strength or interest in strength than is actually being applied, which is an interesting mismatch. Um, the flag burning executive order, if you actually stop to read it, says they are going to prosecute flag burning in contexts where it can be interpreted as legal incitement for other criminal activities. So if you burn an American flag while leading an angry mob towards the Capitol, for example, that's prosecutable. But it explicitly says this does not include the First Amendment protected speech that was defined in the Supreme Court case Texas versus Johnson, which is sort of the touchstone flag burning case. So there's this, all of the rhetoric emanating from the White House, which is then negatively mirrored in the liberal and leftist press, is extremely, rah, rah, Adorno style fascism type stuff. And then it turns out like it's pretty tame. It would actually be difficult to prosecute anybody under this executive order who isn't also doing things like throwing rocks at cops. So there's less there than meets the eye. Um,
Can I ask you before you move on? Do you think that Trump is aware that he's misrepresenting the EO? Because he said in front of cameras in the Oval Office that you will go to jail for 1 year if you burn an American flag, but that's not at all what the EO says, as you have mentioned.
um, I think that the president is a vibrational leader. Uh, I don't think that he's that concerned. And I mean, I think that there's something to be said for this. I think that he is very concerned with the projection of images, uh, and is aware that there's a certain amount of power, especially a certain amount of power for poking his political opponents. But I'm not sure uh, he has a revealed preference for uh, details or execution, either here or in really any of his other policies. Um, so similarly, with the FBI raid on John Bolton, um, honestly, I sort of take the president at his word when he says that he didn't know it was in the works, because if he did know it was in the works, he'd be taking credit for it. Um, it's something that's relatively popular with his base. I think that this is yet another example of how the law and regulation we have written about classified material, it turns out, is extremely capacious. Uh, it's a very good way to just chase people you don't like, because basically nobody in any of these positions is handling classified information in a way that lines up with best practices, because best practices make it impossible to do anything. So, without speaking to, there's been a remarkable dearth of details on what Bolton is supposed actually to have done. But because of that dearth of details, my assumption is that this is something relatively minor league, much like the Biden classified material case, much like the Trump classified material case. Uh, these guys don't do what you're supposed to do with it, because it's impossible to run your life and to do your job if you are, heading into the SIF every time you need to compose an email. Um, And then the Cook firing on the Fed Board of Governors. This is the one where the administration is perhaps on the most shaky ground legally. The way that the law is written, Fed governors may be removed for cause. The cause that the administration is pointing to is the criminal referral of Cook for
Mortgage fraud.
mortgage fraud. Um, so far, without having looked into it in great detail, and not myself being a contract lawyer, apparently her crime uh, is allegedly having claimed two residences as her primary residence. Um, People who are defending her are saying this is an innocent mistake. That seems plausible to me. People who are saying she's got to go say she's a Fed governor. She should know better. That also is plausible to me. I have an opinion. But once again, it's this case where the law is poorly written, the law is ambiguous. And while the administration is projecting this sort of imperial style power over it in its rhetoric, um, there's not actually like necessarily a ton that's novel there. It is the first time this has happened, but the bottom line is that the law is badly written and is ambiguous, and will have to be clarified by the courts, and also by whatever the sort of actual fallout of this criminal referral is. So I think that there's a lot of bark here. I don't think that there's actually a ton of bite. If Donald Trump were actually particularly interested in, instituting some sort of red, white, and blue fascism, he'd have to be a lot more competent and a lot more actually substantively assertive to go about doing that. So I've talked a lot. I'm going to stop talking now.
Yeah, I'll throw it to you. No, that was a good rundown. Thank you. I'll throw it to you, Joseph. And first, I'll say that we've seen other instances this month similar to this, attempted firing of Lisa Cook. Trump fired, or rather, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth fired the chief of the Defense Intelligence Agency after it released a report that contradicted Trump's claims that the strikes on Iran obliterated Iran's nuclear facilities. Trump also fired the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics after it released a jobs report that was not to his liking. So there's arguably a pattern here. So taking those issues and the flag burning one, Joseph, what do you make of this? And do you think that the liberals' concerns about creeping authoritarianism or misuse of presidential power are justified?
Um, I think there's some risks, but also a lot of hysteria. The flag burning, uh, executive order, for example, seems principally to have as its object to goal leftists into burning flags to provide some good campaign ads for the midterms and maybe the 2028 election. Um, as Jude said, the actual substance of the executive order will not actually lead to any material change in American law, let alone, actually present any real changes to American free speech norms or practices. However, it is good at ginning up the outrage machine, and there will be people that will go out and burn the American flag and talk about how much they hate Donald Trump. So, uh, in one sense, it is all again about Trump as a showman. He's projecting his power and promoting a very America first image. We're not going to burn the symbol of the United States. But principally, what he's actually doing is tricking his political opponents into making themselves look bad. Um, the 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 firing of Lisa Cook is the most interesting, um, because if there is one sort of major risk, it is probably control over monetary policy. Um, Historically, presidential control over monetary policy has not gone very well, um, just because there is a great temptation to uh, jury rig the economy to give you favorable rates in the short term for your electoral prospects while completely sinking your economy in the long term. You can ask Argentina about this. That has historically been a major problem coming from the Latin America side. So, the Federal Reserve, whatever criticisms one may have of it, has done a pretty good job of not landing the United States in Argentina's shoes, where you have massive runaway inflation and economic credibility problems from the central bank. So Trump has been harsh on the Federal Reserve before. He's gone after Jerome Powell. He's not happy that he feels like the Fed was cutting rates to provide an electoral benefit for the Bidens during the campaign, and he feels like the Fed is holding out on him and not giving him rate cuts that might boost the economy when he needs it. Um, so the firing of Lisa Cook is just one more way to put pressure on the Fed to conform to his policies, his desired policies, I should say, along with going after the new building that the Fed is constructing, which has gone wildly over budget. Um, so that would be, in my opinion, the biggest concern, but it's more of a generalized concern of, this is probably not something that we really want presidents to be messing with, as opposed to Donald Trump is going to make himself a dictator by arrogating to himself, the power of the Federal Reserve. Um, that has problems, but it's not Hitler, it's not Mussolini.
With the caveat that I actually do believe in political control of the Fed, uh, if the Fed is indeed constitutional. Um, I think that it's worth saying that just because these moves aren't authoritarianism or something worse, doesn't mean that they're good, right? The Bureau of Labor Statistics one, um, you know, like there is evidence that there are issues with BLS methodologies, uh, but you don't fire the person the week after they give you a bad report if you want people to believe that this is about methodology accuracy, uh, because everybody's going to think that people are going to have a hard time trusting your statistics after that, even if you do make the actual substantive improvement. Uh, there are reasons to think that Fed policy. There are like serious people who think that we are overdue for a rate cut. David Malpass, former head of the World Bank, is in the Wall Street Journal today saying Fed models are bad. They're prejudiced against growth. We need rate cuts now, and we need to update the models that we do. So um, there are serious critiques that would inform moves like this. That doesn't mean that they are moves that are being well executed or are particularly good, even if they're not, actual real life fascism.
Yeah, Trump has been remarkably, brazen and kind of inattentive to the problem of creating a general impression of political pressure, motivated by political considerations. We should say, in case listeners don't understand the context of the Federal Reserve thing, when Trump assumed office in this year, there are seven seats on the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. And that board sets the interest rates. And when he assumed office, he had two appointees. Then one unexpectedly resigned. They serve, I think, 14-year terms. And the president generally cannot remove them except for cause. And now we're about to learn what can constitute a legitimate cause for firing. So then he got a third one after that unexpected resignation. So if he fires Cook and replaces her, he's going to have a majority on the board, and he clearly wants them to lower interest rates. I actually think he did nominate the chair, but nevertheless, he'll finally have his majority of people who are going to do what he wants in terms of lowering interest rates. And as Joseph alluded to, the reason that the Federal Reserve is kept politically insulated is because presidents have an interest in lowering rates because that juices the economy in the short term, whereas the Federal Reserve also cares about inflation, and they care about making sure they have tools to get out of a recession in case our economy goes into one. And we've been getting kind of mixed economic data. Trump's tariffs have not led to inflation at the level that many economists had warned about. I think we're still slightly overshooting the Fed target for inflation, and some economists think higher prices are coming, and that's the reason that they're not lowering interest rates. And Joseph, you didn't address the Bolton thing yet, so I'll give you a chance to do that. Do you think there's anything concerning there?
Uh, I don't think that we have enough information to know anything. I mean, they haven't even said really what the raid turned up, or uh, you know, there's been no evidence of prosecution so far, so I don't think that we have any information to go on that. So I will note one other thing on the Federal Reserve. As far as the question of political independence, I do think that constitutionally you can't argue very seriously that the Fed must be completely politically independent, because it must either, it is a federal agency. It must be subject to the control of Congress and the president. Our Constitution doesn't provide for truly independent political agencies. So
Yeah, and that's it. That's an
constitutionally, that is
interesting point.
a very important point to recognize. Now, how we actually want to deal with that in the most productive fashion is another question.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point because kind of hovering in the background for people who are kind of in the know politically is that a lot of people in Trump's orbit have a certain view of the Constitution and of executive power and of the illegitimacy of Congress kind of inhibiting Trump from firing people that are appointed by the president or who work for the executive government. And I guess this can bleed into the Federal Reserve issue as well. On the John Bolton thing, I agree with you. We don't quite have enough information now. It seems very plausible to me that this was targeted because Bolton has become a critic of Trump. Trump took away his Secret Service detail, even though there are plausible claims that Iran wants to kill John Bolton. So that was a controversy earlier in the administration. John Bolton is a huge Iran hawk. And actually, if you read his book, The Room Where It Happened, his White House memoir from when he was a national security advisor from 2018 to 2019. He talks about when he got to the White House, Trump was leaning against pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal, and Trump's aides and advisors at the time were saying you probably shouldn't pull out of the Iran nuclear deal, and John Bolton convinced him to do so. Interestingly, to the extent that we have information, I think we could say with some certainty that the raid was partly motivated by a controversy surrounding that particular book. Because in Trump's first term, the DOJ opened a case against Bolton, and an inquiry against him, rather, about whether he disclosed classified information in that book without going through fully through the clearance process. He did submit his book for review before publication. He was under the impression, he says, that he had cleared the review and was allowed to publish it. But apparently, he didn't get some formal written notice authorizing him to do so that he was supposed to get. A judge at the time did say that Bolton had endangered national security, I believe, by publishing things in that book. I read the book. I'm not sure why. I didn't see anything in there that should be classified. Let's say that. You know, the book is as it sounds, The Room Where It Happened. It's like an insider account of private conversations and stuff. Some people in the Trump White House at the time were arguing that any conversations Trump had with the foreign leader were strictly confidential and couldn't be reported on publicly in a book like that. Um, so
It's
that's the
almost as
situation.
if our entire security apparatus and all the premises around it are extremely stupid.
Yeah. Yeah, there is a big time overclassification problem in America, and it creates this situation where it's like "Show me the man and I'll find you the crime," or whatever that phrase is. Because so many people reveal this classified information, but, the people in power don't really care because it doesn't really threaten them. But then when people reveal information, or when the kind of person they don't like reveals information that is strictly or technically classified, they can go after them. I don't I'm not a fan of the raid, but as you mentioned, Joseph, we don't know more about it. Interestingly, the New York Times reported that the raid was partly predicated on information provided by the CIA to Kash Patel. There are laws against the CIA surveilling American citizens, but if they kind of incidentally obtain information on American citizens that are relevant to criminal activity, they can refer that information to the DOJ and FBI. And we don't know what that intel was, but this might be bigger than the room where it happened thing. And, yeah, for flag burning, I kind of agree with your take, Jude. I read the executive order, and it is not quite how it's being represented. The last thing I'll say, I think on all of these cases, Trump is actually acting in a very politically savvy way. Like, going after Bolton is smart because it's one thing that people haven't remarked on enough, I think, is that it sends a signal to Trump's current staffers that they shouldn't, leave when they leave the White House, they shouldn't become this critic of Trump who is like revealing all of this private information. It's also savvy because nobody likes John Bolton. So people are kind of reluctant to come to his defense right now. If Trump went after some beloved figure among Democrats, there would be much more pushback. But it's kind of laughable to imagine a protest in favor of John Bolton. The same with the Fed. I think it's very politically savvy because if they lower interest rates, the economy is going to, experience benefits of that, and Trump can take credit for it. And if they don't lower interest rates and the economy is not doing good, Trump could say it's the Federal Reserve's fault. I'm trying to do everything I can. And then flag burning, obviously, it makes him seem like, the Republican Party is the party of patriotism in America, and these Democrats are in favor of burning the American flag. Although I don't really know how much people of our generation really care about that issue. It was a big thing in like the 90s and early 2000s. Hillary Clinton supported a ban on flag burning, for example. Um,
Boomers are still a
so,
big voting bloc.
and a big donor class as well. Um, Anything else to say on this before we move on to Latin America? Joseph, why don't you fill us in? What's going on in Latin America? It seems to me that Trump is possibly about to attack Venezuela. So, what's going on there? Do you think we're actually going to see an attack, or is this just some show of force and intimidation?
Yeah, that's the big question. Um, the Trump administration has deployed a lot of naval forces and some additional ones recently. So there are at least three American destroyers, an American amphibious ready group with 4,500 Marines, um, and one, but it looks like there will soon be more attack submarines in the Caribbean. And that is quite a considerable naval force for the normally Pacific waters of the Caribbean Sea. And so the question is, of course, what are we actually doing? The Trump administration's justification is that it is as the components of anti-drug operations. But I'll be honest, I'm not exactly sure what you're going to do with the nuclear submarine against drug traffickers. That seems like a little bit of overkill. So there's been a lot of rumors going around that the Trump administration is preparing for a military confrontation with Venezuela. That to me still seems unrealistic with the information that we have now. But of course, it's possible. The big question is, what is the Trump administration actually thinking about with regard to Venezuela? And that's hard to know simply because their Venezuela negotiations and policy have been somewhat disjointed. early in the Trump administration, it looked like they were going to go for a more conciliatory policy. They sent Rick Grinnell to Venezuela to negotiate with Maduro. Maduro promised to accept deportation flights from the United States, which was the big issue, secured a number of prisoner releases, and there the administration also approved a new license for Chevron just recently to drill in Venezuelan territorial waters as part of a combined sort of syndicate with the Venezuelan state oil company. And while the administration said we're not going to allow Venezuela to profit from this, they'll only get in kind. It does mean that Venezuela is able to extract significantly more oil, and that is oil that they can sell and therefore money that they can use to fund Maduro's government. So, in fact, it was actually quite a favorable deal for Maduro. And then you go from that to not too long afterwards, sending a significant portion of American naval forces into Venezuela. Well, not into Venezuelan territorial waters, but very close to Venezuelan territorial waters. And now there are reports that other oil companies have been asking for licenses to drill in Venezuela, like Chevron received, and have been denied. So, of course, that could just be, lobbyism and favoritism, but it could also signify an actual change in the Trump administration's policy. Um, so there's a big question over, has there been some kind of internal battle within the Trump administration that now Latin American hawks have won, and now the Trump administration is committed to a significantly more escalatory policy towards Venezuela? I still think personally that a military confrontation with Venezuela is unlikely. The Trump administration during his first term actually did something quite similar, sent American military forces around Venezuelan territorial waters. Obviously, nothing came of it. There were also a lot of rumors at that time that Trump was wanted to confront the Venezuelan government. Uh, if you pay attention to Latin American politics, you'll have remembered that the Trump administration in 2019 slapped a bunch of tariffs on Maduro after the presidential election. At that point, there were people who were hoping that the Americans were going to topple Maduro and install Juan Guaido instead as the president. Uh, but obviously that did not happen. So I think the prospects are equivocal at this point. But if there actually has been a significant change, internally in the Trump administration's policy of who the president has decided to trust about how to deal with Latin American policy, so that's something that we can't easily see from the outside. Uh, then it could turn into something more significant.
Just two quick questions with two quick answers before I go to Jude. One, do you think there's any possibility that they will actually kill Maduro? Because the U.S. is not supposed to kill foreign officials, like legally that's prescribed, but they don't consider him the legitimate president. They call him a narco terrorist. And as you mentioned, they say that this other guy is the actual legitimate president and that Maduro stole the election. And secondly, how does the Russia angle fit in here? Venezuela has been called a client state of Russia. That might be a little too strong, but it's a security partner. Russia has delivered it arms. And so I'm wondering, might this be some kind of signal to Russia about its willingness to like safeguard national security and go after partners of Russia, or are there any concerns about a growing military partnership with Russia?
Well, as far as a growing military partnership with Russia, that seems unlikely. Venezuela is a significantly impoverished country, and in the past several years, foreign governments have realized that the Venezuelan government is neither particularly competent nor very trustworthy. You see this with China, especially, which invested billions and billions of dollars in Venezuela uh, and has now essentially stopped and doesn't really want to make any more investments in Venezuela just because the country is essentially falling apart at the seams and they get no return on their investment. So it would be unlikely for either Russia or any other country to decide that they want to significantly increase their ties with the Maduro government just because of the fact that it's a very unreliable partner and quite unstable. As for the possibility of sending a message to Russia, that's more possible, but I would think that you would see some public signal from the administration that this was connected, because of how publicly the Trump administration has been trying to work on Ukraine negotiations. It seems like if that was what they were going for, this is something that they would make more explicit. So it's possible it's being mentioned only in the back rooms, but it seems like if they were actually intending this to be used as political pressure on Russia and on Vladimir Putin, that would be something that would be more publicly disclosed.
And quickly, are they going to kill Maduro?
I highly doubt it.
Okay. Jude, what do you think about all this? Are we about to go to war with Venezuela? What's Trump up to? Do you like what he's up to? Do you hate it?
Same deal, different day. Uh, so I think that to answer the easiest question, I don't think we're going to kill Maduro. If only because our security apparatus is world historically bad at actually assassinating easy targets. Despite 30 years of trying, Fidel Castro died in his bed. And he was a lot closer in a much smaller, easier to get around place than Mr. Maduro. So, for better or worse, I think that he can rest easy. I think that it's worth underlining something that Joseph said, which is nobody really actually knows what the administration's Latin America policy is right now. And you could just say this writ more largely. Nobody can really say what the foreign policy is right now. Trump's government, his electoral movement was coalitional. And so you've got people in there who are neoconservatives. You've got people in there who are classical restrainers who do not want to get involved anywhere. You have China hawks, people who think, we need to get out of the Middle East so that we can really stick it to Xi Jinping in the Philippines or whatever. You have this sort of heterogeneity of actual concrete policy preferences. And somehow, they could make a president. The question is whether they can make a coherent strategy out of these competing and sometimes contradictory impulses. I think that the State Department has been notable in how much more attention it has paid to Western Hemisphere issues, which I think is salutary. I think that if you are going to be flexing muscle somewhere, the actually geographically proximate part of the world makes significantly more sense than, say, the Persian Gulf or Eastern Europe. And that said, so there has been significantly more engagement in Latin America, some of it aggressive. So what we're seeing with Venezuela now, we sort of slapped Panama around over Panama Canal issues. I think that was actually relatively well handled. I don't think that Chinese interests in the Panama Canal are really worth tolerating. Marco Rubio clearly is Cuban in his background. He can actually go speak to people in Spanish, which I think is a much bigger deal than anybody has really reported on. He does not need to rely on interpreters to deal with leaders when he goes on tour, which I think is an enormous asset. That said, I don't really see what we get out of military action in Venezuela. It will immediately turbocharge the existing migrant crisis that we have from Venezuela. It will further destabilize neighbors to Venezuela, Colombia is not looking so hot these days either. Would an American sponsored civil war with American engagement in Venezuela really help Colombia get its act together? I'm skeptical. Um, so, uh, for these various reasons, I tend to think that the administration is going to shy away from actual engagement. We have seen this sort of thing before, not just with Venezuela. 3 weeks ago, Donald Trump sent nuclear submarines to the edge of Russian territorial waters because Dmitry Medvedev sort of drunkenly tweeted something nasty at him, right? Like, you know, this is, I think that one of the few true blue gold plated hermeneutics for the Trump administration is Trump is a cheapskate. He does not like to do things that seem expensive. Uh, Doing boots on the ground wars is expensive. Sort of like moving ships around and yelling at people, not expensive. I'm not actually hugely worried at the moment. But I may look very stupid in 2 weeks' time.
Yeah, I mean, this is consistent with Trump's general process of upping the ante and making a lot of threats, because he wants to get to some sort of conciliation from the other side or concession from the other side, rather. Although in this case, it's kind of hard to see what sort of concession the White House wants Maduro to make, because they're not just saying that he should clamp down on drug trafficking. They're saying that he is a drug trafficker and an illegitimate leader and that he needs to go. And that's not a concession that foreign leaders generally make. It's interesting because a lot of people I normally agree with, like just kind of scrolling on Twitter, I'll notice people who I see eye to eye with on Russia, Ukraine, on Iran, etc., are more supportive of the possibility of military engagement in Venezuela. Maybe Jude, they think what you said earlier, that the Western Hemisphere actually does matter to our interests, and so it makes more sense to have a muscular strategy vis-a-vis Latin America than the Middle East, which is just like a waste of U.S. resources. I think a counterpoint to that would be that our militarism in the Middle East hasn't really secured our interests or achieved our aims. It's often created chaos. I think an argument can be made. I think even John Mearsheimer made a similar argument that it's kind of good that we're doing all the militaristic stuff over in the Middle East because it doesn't really matter as much. We cause chaos in Iraq, but that's not going to, generate too much immediate blowback. It could, motivate terrorism against the U.S. Whereas in Latin America, the refugee crises that would result from a military engagement potentially would affect the United States more directly than our militarism in the Middle East, which usually sends migrants over to Europe. Um, well, I guess stay tuned. We'll keep an eye on the Venezuela situation. It's very difficult to predict what's going to happen. A lot of people thought last week when Trump said that he had this big White House announcement that was going to be at noon on Friday, and then he didn't show up at noon, and it didn't happen until 1. Everyone was saying, "Oh, he's going to announce some sort of attack on Venezuela," and then he just like re-announced that the World Cup was going to be in America. So some people were disappointing. That was quite anticlimactic.
First off, that sucked. I can't believe I watched the TV for that. And second, it's not even the World Cup. It's the World Cup
Oh, right.
drawing.
Right. And it's not even just America, that's also in Canada, the
Right.
games.
No, that for better or worse, that is the moment at which I have felt the maddest of the administration this year.
Yeah. Just
I will
your
say, as
boredom.
far as the question of the defensibility of a Venezuelan intervention, I I do think that it is significantly more defensible, and I can understand why people say that it would be international interest, even if otherwise they are often opposed to interventions, because Venezuela is already right now a massive push factor in illegal immigration into the United States, simply because Maduro, uh, politically and economically, has destroyed the country so thoroughly that it's pushed massive waves of refugees, uh, across all of South America and obviously up into the United States. And so, if the American military could, uh, you know, topple the Maduro government and put in place a stable government that was relatively competent and relatively friendly to our interests, then it would probably end that massive flow of immigration. You would probably see a lot of Venezuelans go back. Uh, and obviously, it would also end the presence of a major security threat via Russia and China. The presence of those two countries in Venezuela, although, again, the Venezuelan regime is incompetent and Russia and China don't actually want more to do with it than they have to. But then, obviously, the counter is, would American military intervention actually be able to install a stable government that would be able to take over from Maduro? That is not very clear.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. When I lived in Austin, I met this Venezuelan immigrant, an illegal immigrant, by the way, and he had been an actor, and a serious one, who was, like, on these, Spanish language, Hispanic style sitcoms, and what are they called? What is the name? I can't believe
Telenovelas?
I'm
Telenovela.
blanking. Yeah, exactly. And he had, lived an affluent life, and then he had just become, like, impoverished, under the regime of Maduro, and left and was, like, working in a kitchen washing dishes in Austin and sending money back to his family back in Venezuela, and he hated Maduro, and I'm quite sure he would want to go back to Venezuela if the opportunity arose. Jude, I'll give you the last word on this topic. You wanted to say something?
Well, so I'm afraid it's not the last word because it's a question for Joseph. Um, is there, if assuming all went well and we put up such a government, is there a sufficiently large Chavista core in Venezuela that there would be ongoing civil strife? Like, if a third of the country actually likes this, that's that is a real problem, and I don't really know enough about Venezuela to say whether that's the case or not.
That's a good question. My answer is I doubt it, simply because of the fact that Venezuela, within a very short amount of time, very much within living memory, has gone from being a prosperous and stable state into utter degradation. Um, Most of the loyalty that Maduro has is solely because of patronage. People sign on to his militias because they get extra handouts from the government. Um, and so the vast majority of the resources of the Venezuelan state is engaged in these kinds of purchases of loyalty through patronage schemes and public giveaways. Uh, I don't think there's actually much loyalty to Maduro himself or to the Chavista Bolivarian Revolution. Um, but I couldn't say for certain simply because I have never been to Venezuela, and the vast majority of people that talk about Venezuela are anti-Maduro Venezuelan refugees. Um, so it's hard to get an exact. Uh, it's hard for me to get a handle on exactly what the internal Chavista politics of Venezuela are like. I would be skeptical, but I wouldn't dismiss it just because so much of the reporting that you get is extremely biased either by people who have fled Venezuela and have a vested interest in overthrowing Maduro, or it's Chavista propaganda, and it's probably not going to actually help you understand what the median supporter of Maduro in Venezuela thinks.
Yeah. Our maximum pressure campaign against Venezuela does give Maduro a kind of rhetorical out, where he could say, oh, the economy is doing bad because of these crushing American sanctions. And it gives it helps him kind of spread his anti colonial ideology. Oh, the gringos from America are trying to take me out because they don't like our revolution. But I don't know what the domestic politics of all that is.
Oh, it's
Um,
definitely like anti-Americanism is very much a thing, and that is what and that is what Hugo Chavez really grabbed onto. Um, but so many people who were pro Chavez are no longer pro Chavez and are very anti Maduro simply because of the hard experience of living through the complete impoverishment of Venezuela. People don't remember it now, but Venezuela used to be one of the most stable and prosperous Latin American countries.
So we only have a few minutes left. Let's talk about some foreign policy issues just briefly to see if there's any room for optimism or if you guys are pessimistic. I'll be curious to learn. Trump has a tendency to say, we're going to have something happen in 2 weeks, or we're going to see what's going to happen in 2 weeks, if he wants to kind of just diffuse some criticisms or sort of get out of a question from a journalist. And he's done that a lot recently. So on Russia Ukraine, supposedly Zelensky was going to meet with Putin within 2 to 3 weeks of the Alaska summit from, I think, 2 weeks ago on Friday. Trump recently said, I think it was last week on Friday, that we're going to know in a couple of weeks whether there's going to be some sort of diplomatic breakthrough and we're heading toward a peace deal. He also recently said that within 2 to 3 weeks, we're going to see a conclusion to the war in Gaza. And then, kind of a separate issue, not related to anything Trump has said, a lot of analysts of US Iran relations and Israel Iran relations are expecting there to be another war, a second round of the 12-day war soon, before the end of the year. Trita Parsi of the Quincy Institute thinks it could be before the end of August. We're recording on August 27th, so that's pretty soon. So, Jude, looking at these various issues and kind of imagining where you think we're actually heading in 2 to 3 weeks, do you see any room for optimism that Trump has communicated? Do you think any of these things are near a breakthrough? Because I think Trump really wants to get a foreign policy breakthrough on one of the major priorities, which would be Russia, Ukraine, the Iran nuclear deal he wanted to get, the Gaza war, which he was able to get a ceasefire shortly before assuming office. What do you when you read the tea leaves, what are you thinking over the next 2 weeks?
Um, I don't think much is going to happen, honestly. So that's optimistic or pessimistic, depending on your inclination. Uh, I don't think that the fundamentals on Russia Ukraine have changed sufficiently for anybody to want to give up the show. Um, the sort of predicted collapse of Ukrainian lines at Pokrovsk uh, did not turn out to be the prelude to some mass rout after all. The Russians are winning on the battlefield, but they aren't just steamrolling the Ukrainians. And so the Ukrainians, have reason to like sort of keep holding out. Things aren't dire. The wolf is not at their door yet. Um, and likewise, the Russian economy is not in free fall. Um, they're not doing great necessarily, but things are not so dire that they want to give up just yet. Um, when I said it, I do a prediction column at the beginning of every year, and I said peace in Russia, Ukraine, by the end of the year. And that was sort of predicated on indicators that the Russian economy was just really headed down the tubes. And it appears that that was wrong. So without some sort of fundamental change to the conditions, I'm not really seeing an end to Russia, Ukraine. Gaza, I mean, maybe there'll be a solution in 2 weeks. I mean, the solution is going to be Israel declares victory, has its way with the population as it sees fit, and starts clearing rubble for high-rise developments, or whatever the day after plan is for the territory. Israel is accelerating its campaign in Gaza. Netanyahu, in conversations with cabinet ministers, said that he is worried about the loss of Western support for Israel's war in Gaza. And so he wants to complete war aims fairly quickly. Ben Gvir and Smotrich, who are to his right, they're coalition members, but they are to his right. They were yelling at the general in charge of the actual campaign for not going quickly enough. So they want things done very quickly. So I suspect that perhaps there will be some version of the next 2 weeks future in which Israel declares some sort of day after plan for what's going to happen in Gaza. and Trump has a press conference and finds a way to get at the front of that parade. And, we call this a win, even though nothing has actually been resolved. And there's been a great deal of unnecessary human suffering to go along with it. As to the Iran nuclear stuff, International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors are back in Iran. It looks as if they may get access again to start monitoring plants again. This would suggest that the Iranians have decided that they don't really have a ton of choices, which would be a vindication in some way for the people who said that there will be no blowback, there will be no ill consequences for just bombing the hell out of them in the middle of high-level diplomatic talks. So have to concede that. At the same time, there are negotiations over snapback sanctions between the top 3 European powers and Iran. It's not really clear to me what the European powers want exactly. It's not really clear to me what concessions Iran has to offer. So to be continued. But the fact that IAEA inspectors are back in Iran does, to me, seem to indicate that it's less likely that there will be American-backed engagement with Iran in the next 2 weeks, because they are, giving the Western order what it wants notionally. Now, maybe the Israelis will go off and, they don't want Iran even to have a civilian program. So maybe they'll go ahead and resume strikes on Iran and try to buffalo the United States into backing them again. In which case, all bets off. Like, who knows what happens. But I'm sort of, if you twisted my arm and said, which of the 3 big, brass rings am I most confident that Trump will be able to lay hold of? I think that I think that it's not unreasonable to say that it kind of looks like we may be able to just resume Iran talks and work towards some kind of deal without further engagement.
Joseph, what do you think?
I'll keep it brief. I'm pretty skeptical. I mostly agree with Jude. I'm skeptical that there will be any progress on Ukraine at this
Wise
point.
thing for an associate editor to say.
And Iran does seem to be making at least some movement with the IAEA. But again, it doesn't seem like substantively there is much movement on any of these issues. And it's unlikely that we'll see anything major happen within the next 2 weeks. So I'm going to take the nothing ever happens option.
Yeah. Yeah, I think
Certainly not in 2 weeks. 2 weeks is not very long.
Well, there was a lot of expectation that Putin and Zelensky were going to meet. So I don't think that Trump was saying the war is going to be over in 2 weeks, but that we're going to see a sign of some diplomatic progress, or we're not going to see it. That was his way of putting it, and clearly it was some sort of rhetorical evasion, which was perhaps warranted. I've been pretty positive about Trump's Russia-Ukraine diplomacy. I do think that the fundamentals of the war are concerning for those of us who want to see an end to the war soon. But I'm going to stay optimistic on that one, and I'm quite pessimistic about the Iran situation. People can read what I wrote today, or what published today, Trump's Iran war mulligan. And then on Gaza, I mean, Israel's plan is clearly to evacuate the strip of Palestinians. I don't think that's going to happen in the next couple of weeks. Interestingly, Netanyahu does have a lot of domestic political pressure right now. There have been some pretty sizable protests. A lot of Israelis, especially in the cities where protests tend to happen, they want these hostages back, and even though they might not be super critical of the humanitarian situation in Gaza, they want to get some sort of deal that brings the hostages home, and that if that means ending the war, then they support ending the war. So maybe we'll see some responsiveness to that, but I'm not counting on it. Let's go to our picks of the
Can
week
I
where
can I
we
make a
each,
quick
yeah,
revision actually based on some breaking news that just came through?
sure.
I am not optimistic about the Iran stuff at all. Actually, uh, Michael Anton who had been the chief technical negotiator on the Iran nuclear deal. Is leaving the State Department in the next couple months. It was just announced in Politico.
Hmm.
If you're getting rid of your top technical negotiator, that suggests a real lack of interest in doing technical negotiations.
Yeah, interesting. I never had a good insight into what his like ideological predilections were or how he thought about the Iran situation generally. But yeah, that does seem like a bad sign. And I have been kind of critical of just sending Witkoff to do these negotiations because he doesn't know about complex nuclear issues. Um, so yeah, I'll keep track of that. That's an interesting update. So yeah, let's do picks of the week where we each pick an article from the American Conservative over the last 7 days or so that we want to highlight. I'm actually going to pick a piece by Jude that I enjoyed reading called "Checking In on the Peace Administration." Obviously, Trump really likes to highlight all these wars he's ended. The number of wars that he's ended seems to be kind of flexible; it changes. But I think the typical number now is like 7. But he's also said some people say it's up to 10 if you include like the wars that he prevented from starting. And Jude, you just kind of talk about how, although it's rhetorically nicer to emphasize the wars that you've ended and how you're spreading peace around the globe, that's better than having this kind of militaristic rhetoric about knocking out all of our enemies and Bush neoconservatism. There are still some problems here, and it still suggests a kind of overengagement of the U.S. in issues that don't actually materially matter to Americans. So, Jude, what's your pick of the week?
Well, I'm going to be a jerk and not pick your piece, honestly. Um, I want to actually, so I want to highlight it today. It's a piece from our print issue. If you do not subscribe to our print issue, it's terrific. It's totally worth it. We revamped the design. It's a beautiful object. It will impress your friends and menace your enemies if you have it on your coffee table. But today on the website, we're featuring A Second Persepolis by Nick Rowan, a friend of mine and managing editor of The Lamp magazine, which is about this documentary made about the then monarchy of Iran in the last years of the Shah and the sort of tragic fate of the filmmaker who was responsible for it. It's a really beautiful piece. It's one of the best things we've run into print this year, I think. Um, so I encourage everybody to give it a look. And if you like what you see, please consider $60 a year print subscription. Impress your friends, menace your enemies. A Second Persepolis, Nick Rowan.
I actually picked that as my pick of the week right after we went to print with the print issue.
Oh no. Okay. Well, do I need to pick
But it's
another one
okay.
then?
It wasn't on the website at the time, and it deserves a double pick of the week
Okay.
pick because it's quite well written. I liked it a lot too. Joseph, what's your pick?
Sure. Well, if we are allowed to take from the print issue, I will take Sadelsky's piece on Europe's population quandary. I've been following pronatalism stuff for a long time now, and apparently it's broken into the popular consciousness. But it's a very good piece. So Sadelsky is Europe's population quandary.
Okay, and that brings us to the end of this episode of Tech Right Now. I want to thank our listeners on podcast apps for listening to the end and remind them that you can watch all of these episodes on YouTube. I want to thank those people watching on YouTube. Please hit the subscribe button, smash the like button, leave a comment, let us know what you think about today's episode. And I want to thank you, Jude, and you, Joseph, for the illuminating discussion. See you next time.